Crockett spoke in an even tone, almost cordial, the kind of calm that carried more weight than raised voices ever could. Pam Bondi sat across from her in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, composed in a tailored navy suit, posture straight, expression steady. Her hair was styled precisely for the cameras, every detail controlled, every movement measured. "Yes, Congresswoman," Bondi said evenly, "that information is part of the public record." "At that time," Crockett continued, "your office, the Florida Attorney General's office, had received numerous complaints regarding Trump University." "There were hundreds of them," Crockett added, her voice still calm, still methodical. "Is that also correct?" she asked, as though confirming a routine administrative detail. Bondi's smile did not shift. "My office received complaints about many organizations," she replied. "We received thousands of complaints every year." Crockett nodded slightly, not interrupting. "But you remember the Trump University complaints specifically," she said. "I remember that there were complaints," Bondi answered. "I'm asking about those complaints," Crockett said, her tone unchanged. "Your office logged them and opened a case file." "March of 2013, Crockett continued, flipping a page in her folder. "Your Consumer Protection Division received formal complaints regarding Trump University. Do you recall that?" "As I said," Bondi replied, "we received many complaints." "I'm asking about these specific ones," Crockett said. "Your staff logged them," Crockett continued. "They opened a case file in March of 2013. Yes or no?" Bondi hesitated briefly. "If the records show that, then yes." Crockett did not react. "In April of 2013, she said, your Consumer Protection Division began investigating whether Trump University violated Florida's Deceptive and Unfair Trade Practices Act. Your office issued subpoenas for documents. Do you remember that?" "I don't recall the specific date," Bondi replied, "but that did occur." "So your office was actively investigating Trump University in April of 2013, Crockett said. "If the records indicate that," Bondi answered, "then I'm sure that's accurate." Crockett turned another page. "In September of 2013, she continued, Donald Trump's foundation donated $25,000 to your Political Action Committee. You remember that donation?" "Yes," Bondi said. "I remember the donation." Crockett nodded again. "And in October of 2013, she said, your office closed the Trump University investigation. No charges were filed. No penalties were imposed," Crockett continued. "The investigation simply ended. Do you remember that?" Bondi's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't recall the exact date the investigation concluded," she said. "But it did conclude without action." "Not every investigation results in prosecution," Bondi added. Crockett raised her hand slightly. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline," she said. "March, complaints are logged. April, an investigation begins. September, you receive a $25,000 donation from the subject of that investigation," Crockett continued. "And in October, the investigation is closed." "Is that an accurate summary?" "Again," Bondi replied, "I wasn't personally involved in—" "You were the Attorney General," Crockett interrupted. "You're telling this committee you were unaware of a major fraud investigation in your own office," Crockett said. "I'm saying I wasn't aware of it at the time the donation was accepted," Bondi replied. "When did you become aware of it?" Crockett asked. Bondi paused. The pause stretched longer than before. "I don't recall the exact date," Bondi said. "Before or after the donation?" Crockett asked. "I'm not certain," Bondi replied. "You're not certain whether you knew your office was investigating someone before accepting $25,000 from them? It's been over a decade, Bondi said. I don't remember every detail. It's $25,000, Crockett said. That's not an insignificant amount. Surely you remember the circumstances surrounding that contribution. Bondi gripped the edge of the table. As I've explained, she said, I was not aware of any investigation at that time. Crockett reached into her folder and pulled out another document. This is an email from your Chief of Staff, she said. It's dated August 15, 2013, 2 weeks before the donation. The subject line reads, Trump University Investigation Update, Crockett continued. Would you like me to read it? The color drained from Bondi's face. The room fell silent except for the sound of reporters typing. The chairman cleared his throat, but said nothing. Crockett began to read. We've received additional complaints about Trump University, she said. Consumer Protection recommends we move forward with formal action. This could be a significant case. Please advise on how you'd like to proceed. That email was sent to your official address, Crockett said, 2 weeks before you accepted the donation. Do you remember receiving it? I receive hundreds of emails a day, Bondi replied. I don't recall every message. You responded to this email the following day, Crockett said, August 16th. Would you like me to read your response? Bondi shifted in her seat. I don't believe that's necessary, she said. Crockett read anyway. Let's discuss this in person, she quoted. Don't move forward until we talk. You wrote that, Crockett said, 2 weeks before accepting the donation. 2 weeks later, Trump's foundation donates $25,000 to your PAC, Crockett continued. 1 month after that, the investigation is closed. No charges, no penalties, nothing. Crockett looked up. I'm trying to understand how this doesn't create the appearance of a conflict, she said. It was not a quid pro quo, Bondi replied. The investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. Your Consumer Protection Division recommended formal action, Crockett said. Recommendations don't always result in prosecution, Bondi replied. They do when there's actual fraud, Crockett said. They don't when the subject of the investigation becomes a donor. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something simple, she said. After you closed that investigation, did you attend Donald Trump's wedding? Bondi blinked. Yes, she said. That was in 2014, Crockett said, a few months after the investigation ended. It wasn't connected, Bondi replied. You investigated him, Crockett said. You accepted money. You closed the investigation, Crockett continued. You attended his wedding. And you're asking this committee to believe that's coincidence. We had a professional relationship, Bondi said. Professional, Crockett repeated. Someone in the gallery laughed softly before stopping themselves. Did other individuals you investigated invite you to their weddings? Crockett asked. I don't see how that's relevant, Bondi replied. It creates an appearance of impropriety, Crockett said. It suggests justice could be influenced. Bondi's voice rose. That is absolutely not true, she said. I have always conducted myself with integrity. Then explain the timeline, Crockett said. Explain the email. Explain the donation. Explain the closure, Crockett continued. Explain the wedding. Explain it in a way that doesn't raise serious ethical concerns. I made a decision based on the evidence, Bondi said. The evidence your staff disagreed with, Crockett replied. 2 weeks after receiving $25,000, Crockett added. The donation didn't influence my decision, Bondi said. Then what did? Crockett asked. What evidence changed in those 2 weeks? Bondi was silent. I'm waiting, Crockett said. What changed? Bondi reached for her water glass. Her hand shook slightly. She took a sip before speaking. "I understand the narrative you're trying to create," Bondi said, "but no laws were broken." "I didn't ask if it was legal," Crockett replied. "I asked if it was right." "There's a difference." Bondi held her expression in place, but the room had shifted. People weren't listening for legal defenses anymore. They were listening for something human, something clear, something that sounded like a moral anchor. Crockett didn't raise her voice to get it. She simply kept asking questions in the same controlled cadence, like a metronome. Bondi tried to lean on process. She tried to lean on procedure. She tried to lean on the idea that paperwork and compliance could stand in for judgment. Crockett's next words made it plain that wasn't going to work here. "Technically acceptable isn't the same thing as publicly defensible," she said. Bondi's lips tightened. "I followed the law," she repeated. "You followed the letter," Crockett said, "and you're asking this committee to ignore what it looks like to the public." Bondi exhaled slowly, as if patience itself were her evidence. Crockett didn't rush her. "The public sees a timeline," Crockett said. "They see internal emails. They see a donor relationship. They see a major case ending without action. They see you at a private event with the same person afterward. And they don't need a law degree to feel uneasy." Bondi tried to regain ground with certainty. "Appearances can be misleading," she said. "That's why we're here," Crockett replied, "to test whether the appearance matches the record." Bondi shifted in her seat, shoulders squaring as if she were bracing. Crockett opened her folder again. "Let's talk about pattern," Crockett said. "Not one case, not one email, not one donation. Pattern is what ethics committees look at. Pattern is what oversight is for. And pattern is what raises confidence or collapses it." Bondi's eyes narrowed slightly. "I reject the premise," she said. "Then we'll stay with the facts," Crockett replied. "Because facts don't require agreement." Crockett flipped to a new page. Her voice stayed level. "In 2014, Crockett said, your office received complaints about Corinthian colleges, a for-profit school chain accused by many former students of deceptive recruitment and financial harm. Do you remember that matter?" Bondi gave a careful answer. "I'm aware there were issues involving many institutions," she said. "Your consumer protection staff recommended formal action there too," Crockett said. "Do you dispute that your staff flagged it as significant?" "I don't recall the specific recommendation," Bondi replied. "You don't recall," Crockett repeated, not as sarcasm, but as a bookmark. "Let's keep going." Bondi's posture remained composed, but her breathing had changed. The composure felt practiced, yet the pauses were becoming longer. Crockett kept her tone neutral, letting the silence do what it naturally did. "It's interesting," Crockett said, "how the details fade when the question is about donors, not defendants." Bondi's jaw tightened again. "That's not fair," she said. "It's not about fair," Crockett replied. "It's about whether the public can trust your judgment when the stakes are national." Bondi tried to answer quickly this time. "My decisions were based on evidence," she said. "And the public record shows certain donors benefited from those decisions," Crockett replied. Bondi's eyes flicked briefly toward the dais, as if looking for a lifeline. No one intervened. Crockett continued without drama. "Let's test the pattern with dates," she said. "Between 2011 and 2019, Crockett said, you attended numerous fundraising events connected to Trump properties. Mar-a-Lago, Trump Tower, and other venues linked to his brand. You raised substantial sums from people with business interests before your office." Bondi lifted her chin. "Fundraising is part of political life," she said. "Fundraising is not the issue," Crockett replied. Transparency is not the issue. The issue is proximity between money and discretion. The issue is what happens to a file after a check clears. Bondi leaned into the microphone. Correlation isn't causation, she said. Then let's look at specific sequences, Crockett replied. She turned another page with no flourish. In 2015, your office received complaints regarding a timeshare company accused by many consumers of deceptive practices. During the window of that inquiry, the CEO donated $15,000 to your political efforts. What happened to the case? Bondi did not answer immediately. I'm not asking you to recite every file, Crockett said. I'm asking about cases where money arrived and the outcome changed. Bondi's voice hardened. I can't speak to every decision made by staff, she said. You can speak to the culture you set, Crockett replied. You can speak to the direction your office took. Crockett's next line landed with quiet force. Because when a pattern is visible from the outside, she said, it usually means the pattern was felt on the inside. Bondi's fingers pressed together on the tabletop. You're implying misconduct, she said. I'm describing optics, Crockett replied, and asking you to explain them. Crockett drew out a chart and held it up at an angle reporters could photograph. This is a comparison my staff prepared from publicly available records, she said. On one side are significant investigations involving entities that donated to your campaigns. On the other side are significant investigations involving entities that did not. Bondi's expression shifted just slightly. This is misleading, Bondi said. The numbers speak for themselves, Crockett replied. According to this analysis, a much smaller share of donor-linked investigations resulted in penalties, and a much larger share of non-donor investigations resulted in prosecution or settlement. Bondi shook her head once. You're oversimplifying, she said. I'm simplifying what the public already sees, Crockett replied. And you can disagree with the framing. But you can't pretend the contrast doesn't exist. Bondi leaned forward as if to push back. Our office worked hard for Floridians, she said. Let's talk about who felt that hard work, Crockett said. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. Your record shows aggressive enforcement in low-level drug possession cases. Thousands of prosecutions. Meanwhile, the record shows fewer high-impact white-collar prosecutions relative to the volume of complaints. Bondi's eyes narrowed. We enforce the law, she said. Enforcement is a choice, Crockett replied. Priorities are choices. Resource allocation is a choice. And the public is allowed to ask why the heaviest hammer fell on people with the least ability to fight back. Bondi opened her mouth, then closed it again. Crockett didn't rush. Equal justice isn't a slogan, Crockett said. It's a practice. It's a set of habits. It's what you do when no one is watching. And it's what you do when powerful people are watching too. Bondi shifted again, shoulders tensing. Crockett flipped to another section of her notes. Now, let's move forward in time, she said. Because what happened after you left office matters too. Bondi's gaze lowered briefly, then returned to Crockett. I pursued professional opportunities, Bondi said. January 2019, you leave the Attorney General's office, Crockett said. Soon after, you join Ballard Partners for government relations work. You also register under foreign agent requirements connected to Qatar. And during that general period, you appear frequently on television defending Donald Trump. Bondi held her expression. Those facts are public, she said. Were you paid for those television appearances? Crockett asked. Yes, Bondi said. Were you paid by your lobbying firm? Crockett asked. Yes, Bondi said. And were you paid under the foreign agent registration arrangement? Crockett asked. Yes, Bondi said again. Crockett's face stayed neutral. So you had multiple revenue streams, she said, while appearing as a legal voice to the public, and while regularly defending the same political figure who is connected to your earlier record as Attorney General. Bondi's tone sharpened. I complied with disclosure rules, she said. Disclosure rules are not the same as public understanding, Crockett replied. Viewers don't read filings before they watch cable news. They don't see what you see behind the scenes. They hear confidence and assume independence. Bondi leaned forward. I was offering legal expertise, she said. And I'm asking whether the audience had enough context to judge that expertise, Crockett replied. Because optics are not a trivial matter when the position you want is supposed to be independent. Bondi's face reddened slightly. I'm an independent professional, she said. Crockett did not argue the label. She tested the pattern. During that period, Crockett said, did you publicly criticize Donald Trump, even once, in a meaningful way? Bondi blinked. I don't accept your characterization of my commentary, she said. That's not an answer, Crockett replied. The room felt smaller. Bondi glanced down at the table. Crockett's next line was softer, but it cut deeper. People can tell the difference between analysis and loyalty, she said. And what you're asking this committee to do is believe your loyalty will stop where the law begins. Bondi's voice rose. That's unfair, she said. Crockett nodded once. Then show us, she said. Bondi inhaled, preparing to respond. Crockett kept going before the moment could drift. Here's the central issue, she said. You're nominated to lead the Department of Justice. That office may face situations involving the same person who has been tied to your career, directly or indirectly, for years. And this committee needs to know whether you can separate personal allegiance from professional duty. Bondi's lips pressed together. Crockett looked down at her notes, then back up. Now I want to ask you the question that matters most, she said. Bondi shifted as if she already knew it was coming. Crockett didn't dramatize it. She didn't frame it as an attack. She treated it like the core of the job. If a president commits a federal offense, Crockett said, would you be willing to authorize prosecution based on the evidence, even if that president is the one who appointed you? The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Bondi stared at Crockett. That's hypothetical, she said. It's not hypothetical, Crockett replied. It's the job. It's exactly the kind of test an attorney general has to pass in advance. You can't take this office if your independence collapses at the first hard case. Bondi's face shifted through calculation. I would review the evidence and follow the law, she said. That's still not an answer, Crockett replied. I'm not asking whether you would review. I'm asking whether you would be willing. Would you be willing to act, even when it costs you personally? Bondi looked down briefly, then back up. I would treat every matter fairly, she said. Crockett held her gaze. You're avoiding the simplest sentence, she said. And the reason you're avoiding it is obvious to everyone watching. Bondi's voice tightened. That's your opinion, she said. It's the impression you're creating, Crockett replied, and impressions matter in this job. The silence stretched again. A laptop fan hummed somewhere in the back. Someone shifted in their chair, then stopped moving. Bondi opened her mouth, then closed it. Crockett didn't interrupt the pause. She let it speak. When Bondi finally spoke, her words were careful. I'm not going to speculate, she said. Crockett nodded slowly. I'm not asking you to speculate, she replied. I'm asking you to commit to principle. Principle is the whole point of this position. Crockett closed her folder halfway, then opened it again, as if choosing her next move. Her tone changed. Not softer exactly, but more direct. Let's talk about why you want this job, she said. Bondi blinked, caught off guard by the pivot. I want to serve the American people, she said. That's not what I asked, Crockett replied. I asked why you want it, for real. Not the prepared line, not the standard answer. The reason. Bondi swallowed. I've spent my career in public service, Bondi said. And then you moved quickly into lobbying and paid media work, Crockett replied. So I'm asking what changed? Why return now? Bondi's eyes flicked toward the dais again. No one spoke. Bondi exhaled. Because President Trump asked me, she said. Crockett's expression did not change. There it is, she said quietly. And that's exactly why this committee has to press you harder than usual. Because the public cannot afford an attorney general who serves one person. Bondi shook her head. I'm my own person, she said. Crockett didn't argue with the phrase. She returned to the record. Your record shows repeated proximity, she said. Proximity to donations, proximity to discretion, proximity to personal association, proximity to paid defense. And now proximity to power. Crockett leaned back slightly. Here's the truth, she said. You can call it coincidence. You can call it politics. You can call it process. But you cannot call it reassuring. Bondi's face flushed deeper. I have integrity, she said. Then answer one clear question, Crockett replied. Not a process answer. Not a compliance answer. A yes or no statement of principle. Bondi stared at the tabletop. Her hands shifted, fingers tightening, then releasing. Crockett waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. The kind of silence that makes every camera look sharper. Bondi's breathing became audible in the microphone. When Bondi finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller. I would handle any matter involving the president with the utmost care, she said. Crockett nodded once, slow and controlled. And you still couldn't say it, she replied. The room stayed still. No one rushed to rescue the moment. Crockett closed the folder again, this time fully. I have one final question, she said. Bondi looked up, eyes glossy. Crockett's tone turned quiet, almost tired, as if this part weighed more than the rest. When you took the oath of office as Florida Attorney General, did you mean it? Bondi swallowed. Yes, she said. Did you mean it in the way the public understands an oath? Crockett asked, without fear or favor. Without special treatment. Without the powerful getting a different system than everyone else. Bondi's lips parted, then stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Bondi's face tightened as though she were fighting her own reaction. Her eyes watered. She looked down, then up again, but she couldn't find a sentence that landed clean. Crockett waited, still, steady, unblinking. Bondi's voice finally broke through. I tried to do the right thing, she said. The right thing for who? Crockett asked, not loudly, not cruelly, just plainly. For the public. For the cases. For the oath. For the people who don't have access, money, or influence. Bondi didn't answer. Crockett stood, gathering her papers with a controlled, almost clinical calm. I have no further questions, she said. The chairman cleared his throat and looked down the line. Does any senator wish to question the nominee? For a moment, no one moved. A voice began to speak, then stopped. One by one, senators declined, not with speeches, not with outrage, but with short refusals. No one wanted to be the next person on camera after that exchange. Bondi remained seated at the witness table, staring forward, mascara smudged, hands trembling. The room looked like it was watching a decision form in real time. Outside that room, Crockett's questions would travel fast. The timeline would be clipped into short segments. The email would become a graphic. The pause would become a headline. The refusal to deliver a simple commitment would become the moment people replayed. Because in politics, the hardest evidence is often the sentence someone can't bring themselves to say. The hearing room slowly emptied, but the weight of what had just happened did not. Bondi remained seated as staffers whispered and cameras lingered longer than usual. She looked less like a nominee awaiting confirmation and more like someone replaying every decision that led her there. Nothing dramatic had occurred in the traditional sense. No shouting, no gavel slamming, no theatrical collapse. What happened instead was quieter and more damaging. A record had been read back to her in public. A pattern had been laid out without accusation, only sequence. And when asked for the one sentence that could have steadied the moment, she could not say it. That absence said more than any rebuttal ever could. Crockett did not raise her voice when she stood to leave. She did not look toward the cameras. She did not smile or signal victory. She simply gathered her papers and walked out of the room. The exchange was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Within minutes, aides were already anticipating the fallout. Clips were being cut in real time. The email reference would lead every segment. The unanswered question would anchor every headline. The silence would be replayed again and again. Some commentators would later say Crockett went too far. Others would argue she did not go far enough. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The hearing changed the frame of the nomination. It shifted the story from qualifications to credibility. Bondi had entered the room as a nominee with institutional backing. She left as a symbol of something larger than herself. A debate about how justice is practiced, not just how it is described. A test of whether loyalty can coexist with independence. A reminder that legal authority depends as much on trust as it does on statute. The timeline mattered because it was simple. Complaints arrived. An investigation began. Money changed hands. The investigation ended. No legal conclusion was required for the public to ask questions. The email mattered because it contradicted uncertainty. It showed awareness. It showed involvement. It showed direction. And it existed before the donation, not after. The wedding mattered not because it was illegal. It mattered because it humanized the relationship. It blurred the line between professional distance and personal proximity. It reinforced the appearance that power was reciprocal. And appearances are what institutions rise or fall on. The television appearances mattered because they extended the pattern beyond office. They showed continuity rather than separation. They raised questions about independence when commentary aligned perfectly with interest. They complicated the claim of neutrality, and they tied the past to the present nomination. The lobbying work mattered because it completed the arc. Public authority was followed by private profit. Regulatory oversight became marketable insight. Connections gained in office became assets after office. And the line between service and self-interest became harder to trace. None of this required a criminal allegation to resonate. It required only common sense. It required only the understanding that justice must be visibly impartial. It required only the expectation that power should not reward loyalty. It required only the belief that law is more than a transaction. The most damaging moment did not come from any document. It came from a question. A simple one, asked without theatrics. Would you prosecute a president if the evidence required it? And the inability to answer that question cleanly. That moment lingered because it spoke to motive. It spoke to independence. It spoke to whether past behavior predicts future restraint. It spoke to whether allegiance can be set aside when the stakes demand it. And it spoke through silence rather than denial. Bondi's tears would be interpreted in different ways. Some would see them as exhaustion. Some would see them as frustration. Some would see them as the weight of unfair scrutiny. Others would see them as the cost of unresolved contradictions. Emotion, like power, invites interpretation. But emotion was not what defined the hearing. The record did. The sequence did. The unanswered commitments did. And the refusal to say one sentence that the office requires did. In the days that followed, defenders would argue technical compliance. They would cite reporting rules. They would point to procedures followed. They would emphasize legality over perception. They would insist the system worked as designed. Critics would respond that the system may be designed that way. And that is the problem. That justice, shaped by access, is justice distorted. That discretion without visible independence breeds mistrust. That institutions lose legitimacy not through scandal, but through erosion. And that erosion begins when silence replaces clarity. The confirmation vote would still be scheduled. Formalities would still proceed. Statements would still be issued. But the outcome no longer felt uncertain. Momentum had shifted in a way no floor speech could undo. Because the public does not require perfect officials. It requires believable ones. It requires leaders who can draw clear lines under pressure. It requires answers that do not depend on who is asking. And it requires an attorney general who can say no to power. The question Crockett asked was not partisan. It was institutional. It was about whether the law applies upward as well as downward. It was about whether accountability survives proximity. It was about whether justice belongs to everyone or only to some. In that sense, the hearing was never really about Bondi alone. It was about a system that rewards loyalty more reliably than restraint. It was about careers built on access rather than outcomes. It was about whether oaths mean what the public thinks they mean. And it was about what happens when someone finally asks that out loud. When justice is treated as flexible, trust becomes fragile. When enforcement feels selective, legitimacy fades. When power goes unchallenged, silence becomes policy. And when silence answers the most important question, it answers all of them. Crockett did not declare a verdict. She did not need to. The record spoke. The pauses spoke. And the refusal to commit spoke loudest of all. In the end, the hearing offered no dramatic conclusion. There was no confession. There was no legal finding. There was only an absence where certainty should have been. And, in public life, absence can be decisive. Because when someone seeks control over justice, clarity is the minimum requirement. When someone asks for trust, principle must be visible. When someone holds power over prosecution, independence must be unmistakable. And when someone cannot say whose law they will enforce, the answer is already understood. That was the moment the room recognized what had happened. Not an ambush, not a spectacle, but a reckoning built from sequence and restraint. A reckoning delivered without shouting and sealed by silence. And long after the room cleared, one question remained unanswered. Not because it was unfair, not because it was hypothetical, but because answering it would have required choosing law over loyalty, and that choice had already been made. The aftermath did not unfold with sirens or sudden announcements. It unfolded through repetition, through slow accumulation, through the way a moment settles into public memory, and through the recognition that some answers matter more than credentials. Every hearing produces transcripts, but not every hearing produces a turning point. This one did because it reduced power to its simplest test. Not whether rules were followed, not whether paperwork was filed correctly, but whether independence could be stated without hesitation. That test was not passed. Supporters attempted to reframe the exchange as hostile. They described it as unfairly aggressive. They argued that tone mattered more than substance. But tone was not what lingered. Substance was. The questions were not speculative. They were grounded in public documents. They were rooted in dates, emails, donations, and outcomes. They did not require assumptions about intent. They required only acknowledgement of sequence. Sequence is what makes patterns visible. Sequence is what allows reasonable people to draw conclusions. Sequence is how accountability works in the absence of confession. And sequence does not argue back. It simply remains. The defense leaned heavily on legality, on what could be proven versus what could be inferred, on the idea that absence of violation equals absence of concern. But public trust does not operate on courtroom standards alone. It operates on confidence. Confidence is fragile when discretion meets money. Confidence weakens when silence replaces principle. Confidence erodes when loyalty appears durable and independence appears conditional. And confidence cannot be restored by explanation after the fact. It requires clarity in the moment. The most revealing aspect was not contradiction. It was hesitation. Contradictions can be debated. Hesitation exposes internal conflict. And internal conflict at that level is disqualifying. The Attorney General's role is uniquely unforgiving. It does not allow for ambiguity when power is involved. It does not tolerate selective courage. It requires readiness to act even when the consequences are personal. That readiness must be visible. The hearing demonstrated what happens when it is not. Not chaos, not outrage, but quiet recalibration, a collective reassessment of trust. No senator needed to say the word disqualified. The exchange did that work on its own, by narrowing the issue to its core, by stripping away talking points, by leaving only one unanswered obligation. Some careers end with scandal, others end with silence. Silence that confirms what defense cannot undo. Silence that lingers longer than denial. Silence that answers the question by refusing to speak. The public understands this instinctively. People recognize evasion when they see it. They recognize loyalty when it outweighs duty. They recognize when power is protected rather than restrained. And they remember who stayed quiet at the wrong moment. In the weeks that followed, analysis would multiply. Panels would debate tone and intent. Op-eds would argue process versus principle. But none of that would erase the image. A nominee unable to commit to independence. That image mattered because it was simple. No context was required. No legal background was necessary. Just a question and a pause. And the absence of a clear answer. Institutions depend on moments like these. Moments that reveal limits. Moments that test resilience. Moments that remind power it is observed, and moments that recalibrate expectation. The Department of Justice is not just an agency. It is a promise that law applies evenly, that status does not confer immunity, and that allegiance does not override accountability. When that promise is placed in doubt, confirmation becomes secondary, because legitimacy precedes authority, and authority without legitimacy cannot function. It only persists until challenged again. The hearing did not settle every argument. It did not answer every question. But it answered the most important one indirectly, whether independence was absolute or conditional. And the answer, delivered through silence, was clear. That clarity is why the moment endures, not because of outrage, not because of spectacle, but because of restraint. And because restraint revealed what pressure concealed. In public life, words matter, but refusals matter more. What someone will not say defines the boundary of their courage. And boundaries are what positions of power test relentlessly. This boundary was exposed. The question was simple. The stakes were not. And the inability to meet them ended the matter more effectively than any vote. Because once doubt replaces trust, authority cannot follow. It can only be questioned. That is how the hearing concluded, not with a verdict, not with applause, but with an understanding, one that required no explanation. The understanding settled slowly, like dust after movement stops. Nothing else needed to be added. No final accusation would have improved the clarity of the moment. The absence of certainty had already filled the room, and everyone present knew it. In politics, credibility is rarely lost all at once. It erodes through accumulation, through patterns left unexplained, through moments when principle is tested and deferred. This hearing gathered those moments into one frame. The nominee had prepared for questions about experience. She had prepared for questions about management. She had prepared for questions about law and procedure. What she had not prepared for was a question about allegiance, because allegiance is harder to defend than competence. The exchange forced a distinction that often remains blurred. The difference between serving an office and serving a person, between loyalty as character and loyalty as liability, between discretion and deference, and between silence and neutrality. There is a reason the question resonated beyond the room. It did not belong to one party. It did not belong to one moment. It belonged to the structure of power itself. It asked where authority ultimately points. People who watched did not need commentary to understand it. They did not need legal analysis. They recognized the pause instinctively. They recognized avoidance when it appears under pressure. And they recognized what it means when someone cannot draw a line. Public trust depends on visible restraint. It depends on the belief that power will limit itself, that loyalty has an endpoint, that law does not bend to familiarity, and that oaths are not conditional. The hearing stripped away abstraction. It reduced the issue to a single decision point, a moment where independence could be affirmed or withheld, where clarity could replace caution, and where caution prevailed instead. From that point forward, the nomination carried a different weight. Every defense sounded like explanation after the fact. Every appeal to experience felt secondary. Every assurance rang against the unanswered question. And every silence echoed the one before it. This is how accountability sometimes works. Not through punishment, not through exposure of wrongdoing, but through recognition, through the collective acknowledgement that something essential is missing. Institutions survive on that recognition. They correct course when credibility falters. They recalibrate when trust is strained. They depend on moments that reveal rather than conceal, and they endure by responding to those moments honestly. The hearing did not demand perfection. It demanded independence. It did not require speculation. It required a commitment. And commitment was the one thing withheld. When someone seeks authority over justice, that matters. Because justice without independence becomes management. Because enforcement without courage becomes performance. Because law without principle becomes leverage. And because leverage always serves someone. The room understood this before the cameras did. The stillness said it plainly. The absence of follow-up questions confirmed it. No one wanted to dilute the moment by continuing. Nothing more needed to be said. Outside the hearing, narratives would compete. But inside the record, the meaning was settled. The exchange had drawn a line, and the nominee had stopped short of crossing it. That hesitation defined the outcome. In the end, the most important testimony was not spoken. It was demonstrated through what was avoided, through what remained unsaid, and through the silence that followed. That silence did not accuse. It did not exaggerate. It did not editorialize. It simply stood where certainty should have been. And in doing so, it answered everything. Power invites scrutiny. Justice demands it. And when scrutiny meets evasion, trust dissolves. That is not punishment. That is consequence. The hearing closed without spectacle, but its effect was enduring. It reminded everyone watching that integrity is not inferred. It must be stated, and when it cannot be, the absence speaks. That is how the matter ended, not with outrage, not with celebration, but with a conclusion drawn quietly and collectively. Because sometimes the clearest answer is the one never given. The conclusion did not arrive with a formal declaration. It arrived with acceptance. Acceptance that the central question had been asked and left unanswered. Acceptance that nothing further would clarify it, and acceptance that silence itself had become the record. For many watching, that was the decisive moment. Not the documents, not the timelines, not the numbers, but the realization that independence had been framed as optional rather than foundational. That realization lingered long after the cameras shut off. Powerful offices are built on expectations as much as statutes. They function because the public believes limits will be respected. They endure because leaders demonstrate restraint before it is demanded. They survive because principles are articulated, not implied. And when those expectations are unmet, confidence fractures. The hearing made one thing unmistakably clear. Technical compliance cannot substitute for moral clarity. Process cannot replace conviction. And experience cannot outweigh hesitation when principle is tested. Those distinctions matter most at the highest levels. No single exchange can define an entire career, but some exchanges reveal its trajectory. They show how decisions accumulate, how proximity shapes judgment, how loyalty becomes reflexive, and how reflex replaces reflection. The nominee's defenders would argue nuance. They would insist on complexity. They would frame the moment as unfairly narrow. But the public rarely evaluates power through complexity alone. They evaluate it through trust. Trust is built when answers are direct, when commitments are unambiguous, when principles are articulated without qualifiers, and when accountability is embraced rather than deferred. That standard was not met. The hearing did not accuse. It did not convict. It did not declare wrongdoing. It simply asked for clarity where clarity was required. was, and it did not receive it. That absence reshaped the narrative. The nomination was no longer about readiness. It became about reliability, about whether judgment could be exercised without favor, about whether independence could withstand loyalty. These are not partisan questions. They are institutional ones. They define whether power serves law or law serves power. They determine whether authority restrains itself, and they decide whether justice is credible. When someone seeks to lead the nation's highest law enforcement body, hesitation matters, not because perfection is expected, but because courage must be visible, because restraint must be explicit, and because silence at the wrong moment is disqualifying. The hearing exposed a fault line that could not be smoothed over. It showed where certainty ended. It showed where allegiance complicated judgment. It showed where commitment dissolved into caution. And it showed the cost of that shift. In the days that followed, explanations would circulate. Statements would be issued. Allies would defend. Critics would amplify. But none of that altered the central fact. The moment had already happened. It had already been seen. It had already been understood. And it had already settled into public consciousness. Reinterpretation could not erase it. Public life is unforgiving in this way. It rewards clarity and punishes evasion. It forgives mistakes, but not avoidance. It tolerates disagreement, but not silence, where principle is required. And it remembers moments that reveal limits. This hearing revealed one, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through restraint. And restraint, when it exposes hesitation, can be devastating. No further questioning was necessary. No dramatic follow-up was needed. The exchange had reached its natural end. The question had been asked fully. The answer had been given indirectly. That is how accountability sometimes appears, not as judgment, not as condemnation, but as clarity. A clarity that emerges when someone cannot say what must be said. In that clarity, the outcome became inevitable, not because of politics, not because of personality, but because independence had not been affirmed. And without that affirmation, authority cannot stand. The hearing closed. The room emptied. The record remained. And with it a silence that required no interpretation.